It's been a very long, but I think a very interesting day, and I appreciate your willingness to continue to engage, so thank you. And the same thing to our last panelists. And let me just very briefly introduce them to you. To some extent, over the course of the day, I think they've probably become introduced to you. We will start with Hugh Gusterson, who is a professor of anthropology and sociology at George Mason University. We will actually next turn to Professor Malini, right? Schueller, a professor of English and American Studies, or is there no?
English.
English at the University of Florida. Finally, we will turn to Professor Paul Joseph, who is in the Department of Sociology and is also the Director of Peace and Justice Studies at Tufts University.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Michael Schaff mentioned Lynn Cheney's blacklist of dangerous academics. What he didn't mention is that my name is the very first on that blacklist. And I appreciate your helping to rehabilitate me into polite society. We've been talking today about the effects of the war on terror on the university in the US. I want to talk about something that you hear almost nothing about in the US media, which is the effect of the war in Iraq on the universities in Iraq. And I'm assuming that most of you don't know a whole lot about that. As you'll see from this quote, Iraq in about 1980 had one of the best university systems in the Middle East. It now has arguably the worst. Its university system has been more or less completely destroyed and unmade. It's a story that I think Americans need to know more about. We need to reflect, I think, on whether the US has, or what kind of responsibility the US has for what happened to Iraqi universities. So let me say a little bit about the Iraqi university system in, to pick an arbitrary date, 1980. It was a secular system where Iraqi women were not forced to wear hijab or anything like that. University tuition was completely free. Between 1968 and 1980, the number of students getting a free education at universities in Iraq more or less doubled. By 1991, 30% of all the faculty were women, which meant they were doing better than Princeton in 1991. Something to bear in mind in terms of our stereotypes about the backwardness of women in Middle Eastern societies. They even subsidized study abroad for Iraqis who went to Britain and America and so on. And many students from other Middle Eastern countries came to study in Iraq because it had a reputation of having a very good education system. And in the earlier years of Saddam Hussein's rule, this is not to praise Saddam Hussein, who I don't have much admiration for, but we have to recognize that he did good things along with bad things. So literacy in Iraq went from 52% in 1977 to 80% in 1987, which is about the literacy rate in Singapore at that time. So, Iraq didn't have universities like Princeton and Harvard and MIT. What they did have was a system where they took oil money, the money that they got from selling their oil, they plowed it into free education to create a burgeoning professional class of lawyers, doctors, and engineers in particular to contribute to development in Iraq. So let's talk about what happened from about 1991 onwards to this system. Now, Thomas Ricks, the Washington Post journalist, says that we shouldn't see the war between the US and Iraq as something that began in 2003. He says we should see it as having begun in 1991. It had a kinetic phase in 1991 that was fairly brief. It then had a long phase of international sanctions, which were a continuation of hostilities between the US and Iraq, and then it had a second kinetic phase in 2003. So looking at it in those terms, I think we have to begin telling the story of the unmaking of the Iraqi university by thinking about what the international sanctions regime did to it. The point of the international sanctions was to prevent Iraq from reconstructing its nuclear weapons program and more broadly any kind of WMD program. But over time there was a kind of slippage where that might have been the declared purpose of the regime, but the actual purpose of the sanctions regime was to try to make life so intolerable for people in Iraq that they would overthrow Saddam Hussein's regime. And so under the sanctions regime, many requests that were made for materials in the education system in Iraq were routinely denied, although they were requesting the kinds of materials that it's hard to see how they could have contributed to a nuclear weapons program. So, for example, the music departments in Iraqi universities, every request they made for sheet music was denied under the sanctions program. Maybe I lack the requisite imagination, but I find it hard to see, how a Beethoven score or something is going to contribute to constructing a nuclear weapon. So about 70% of their requests were denied. By the end of the 1990s, the elementary schools lacked pencils, erasers, chalk, stuff like that. All journals were embargoed, even social science and humanities journals. So if you went to an Iraqi university library in 1995, you would find that all of their journals pretty much ended in 1991. These were years of great financial hardship for Iraqi faculty, about 10,000 of whom emigrated to other countries because their salaries fell by just enormous proportions. And in those years, the literacy rate that had been built up in the early years of Saddam Hussein's rule declined. So a literacy rate that was at 80% in 1987 had fallen to 50% by 1998. So by 1998, Iraq had a literacy rate the same as Papua New Guinea's. This is a quote from a Christian Science Monitor piece about life in Iraqi universities at the end of the sanctions regime. Lab supplies dwindled, broken equipment could not be replaced, and printing presses ceased operation. Entire classrooms of science students would gather around one piece of equipment. For select professors and administrators who supported the Ba'ath Party, salaries rose, but the majority of professors had to take second jobs as tutors or start small businesses. Okay, well, let's move to the invasion of 2003. This is a picture of the National Library and Archive in Baghdad. As you can see, it's not in terribly good shape. It was looted. 25% of the books in that library were destroyed. 60% of their original archival documents were destroyed, and all of the Ba'ath Party archives that were there were destroyed. Within the Pentagon, the Office of Reconstruction and Humanitarian Assistance had warned that it would be important to protect cultural sites, including archives, libraries, museums, and universities. Donald Rumsfeld and the people around him chose to ignore that warning. They guarded the Ministry of Oil, as I expect you recall, but they didn't guard any of these libraries or archives or university kinds of institutions. So during the sort of orgy of looting that followed the American invasion, about 1 million books were destroyed, 10 million documents are thought to have been destroyed. Just to give you one example, the Central Al-Akh Library had 45,000 rare books in it, and it was burned to the ground. In many universities, the electrical wiring was ripped out of the walls. It was stripped bare of computers, desks, chairs. So if you imagine Case Western University, this room would have no chairs in it anymore. All the computers and the electronic equipment would be ripped out. The light bulbs would probably be ripped out. If you imagine the university like that, needing all of that stuff restored, right? That was what the U.S. Provisional Authority had to deal with when they took over responsibility for that system. Now, before I tell you about their response to that predicament of these universities being stripped bare like that, let me just mention one more complication, if you like. This is Paul Bremer, who George W. Bush put in charge of Iraq. You may remember that his order number 1, when he took over as Viceroy of Iraq, was a de-Baathification order. He ordered that anyone down to, I think, 3 or 4 ranks down in the Ba'ath Party would automatically lose their jobs. Now, it was a requirement under Saddam Hussein's regime that if you wanted to advance in an academic career, you had to join the Ba'ath Party. It's sort of like being a good Christian in Alabama or something like that. you may not necessarily really be so into the Christianity thing, but it's probably a good idea to go to church, right, if you want to get along. Same thing with the Ba'ath Party in Iraq, especially if you wanted to be a dean or a provost or or a president. So immediately what Paul Bremer did is he removed over 1,000 of the senior administrators and senior faculty of all of the universities in Iraq. So all the people who were most experienced in running these universities, who understood them, were immediately banned from employment in the universities. This is John Agresto. He is the man who George W. Bush put in charge of the Iraqi higher education system. He had been a college president in the United States. He was president of St. John's College in Santa Fe. It's a college that is deeply hostile to multicultural education. It's proud to have a sort of 19th century Western civilization great books curriculum. This is the person who George Bush decided would be a good person to put in charge of the Iraqi university system. When he took the job, he said he was hoping to establish classes in comparative religion where the Bible would be taught in Iraqi universities. He spoke no Arabic, and Rajiv Chandrasekaran of the Washington Post, when he arrived, interviewed Agresto and asked him, you've had a month to prepare for taking over your responsibilities here. I'm curious to know what you've been reading about Iraq. And he said, I haven't been reading anything about Iraq. I wanted to come with an open mind. So I chose not to read any books. To be completely fair to John Agresto, you see that little line there, mugged by reality. He would later, after he left Iraq, completely disillusioned with the Bush administration and with his experience in Reconstruction, he would write his memoirs that were called Mugged by Reality, and he described himself as a neoconservative mugged by reality. I forgot to mention one more interesting thing about him. You may wonder, why did they pluck him out of American life to appoint him? He was a very close friend of Lynn Cheney and of Donald Rumsfeld. And the story that Rajiv Chandrasekaran tells in Imperial Life in the Emerald City is that so many of the people who were put in charge of Reconstruction in Iraq were people who had patronage appointments because they were major Republican donors or were in Republican networks. Okay, so what happened in terms of replacing all the torn out light bulbs and computers and chairs and blackboards and all the rest of it? Well, the UN and the World Bank did a study, and they recommended that the US needed to invest $2 billion in rebuilding Iraq's university. Agresto looked over their numbers and decided that $1.2 billion would do it. So Agresto requested $1.2 billion to rebuild Iraq's university system. To give you, that's for 22 universities and 43 colleges, by the way, $1.2 billion. To give you a little bit of scale, my university, George Mason University, has an annual budget of $900 million a year. So he requested a little bit more than my university's annual budget to rebuild 22 universities and 43 colleges. Congress looked over his numbers, and they decided that a good number to appropriate would be $8 million. A friend of mine did a graphic that I'm afraid I don't have with me, or I would show it to you, that shows a big circle of what the UN recommended, a slightly smaller circle of what Agresto recommended, and then this teeny, teeny, tiny dot in the middle, which is what the US Congress actually appropriated. But they did appropriate 3 times that much, $25 million through USAID, to go to American universities to do curriculum development for Iraqi universities. So for example, SUNY Stony Brook, a fine anthropology department, they got $4 million, a half of all the money that had been appropriated for the Iraqi university system, $4 million to do curriculum development on a new archaeology curriculum for Iraq, right? And this goes to American academics. But it gets worse. So in the era of extreme sectarian warfare, which the anthropologist Marshall Sahlins has argued, tendentiously perhaps, was deliberately unleashed by American military policies during the occupation. During this period of intense sectarian warfare, the Iraqi universities were engulfed with violence. At first, they were trying to hold out as the last cosmopolitan space in Iraq, where women needn't wear the hijab, where Shiites and Sunnis could study side by side. Classes were being terrorized by militias. University faculty found themselves getting bullets in the mail. Professors would open their door and find militias threatening to kill them if they didn't change their curriculum and so on. Estimates vary, but between 160 and 380 university professors had been assassinated in this ethno-sectarian warfare by 2006. Roughly 30% of the university faculty emigrated mainly to other Middle Eastern countries. And women who did not come in hijab were often intimidated. And there's an irony here I want to note, that a number of liberal mainstream feminists in the US supported the attack on Iraq because they believed that it would help women's rights in Iraq. The consequence of the invasion that they sponsored was that reasonably secular Iraqi women now had to go to class veiled if they dared go to class at all. One of the things that saddens me, I have a list of the names of many of the confirmed assassinated professors, and I've been searching on the web for pictures of them, and I can only find one. And it troubles me that they are anonymous. This is Issam al-Rawi. He was the head of the Association of Iraqi Lecturers, so in other words, a position not so dissimilar from Kerry Nelson's. If you imagine Kerry Nelson being stopped by gunmen in his car and having 43 bullets in him. He was a geology professor who had been compiling a list of all the professors who were assassinated when they killed him. This is a picture of the funeral of Khalid Nasir al-Miai. He was the very last neurologist in Basra. After they assassinated him, there weren't any more neurologists there. Okay, in closing, I have a few minutes left. I want to say a little bit about what I think of as the other side of the ledger, which is the connection between what was happening to the university system in Iraq and what was happening to the American university system at the same time. So, in many ways, the same war that unbuilt Iraqi universities helped further build up American universities. War has always been good for the bottom line of American universities. We can argue about whether war creates assaults on freedom of speech and stuff like that, but one thing we know about wars from Vietnam, the Cold War, to today, is that wars always bring more government funding into universities. And this graph shows how after 9/11, this is Pentagon R&D money for research in universities. You can see the very steep increase in that graph there. The DoD was spending about $1 billion a year on R&D for universities by last year. And on top of that, the Department of Homeland Security was spending about another $49 million. And some of that went to new centers. I'm afraid I ran out of space here. I managed to list about half of the universities that got new centers, and then I ran out of space, and I figured I won't do a second page. So that's why there's ... after El Paso. So these are the universities who are getting new centers for bioterrorism preparedness. They're getting the ICI centers that David Price has written about. These are intelligence community centers of academic excellence funded by the CIA and other intelligence organizations. Often new degree programs are going with this. There are new degree programs in intelligence studies, homeland security. My university has a new degree program in biodefense. We have a bio-level safety 3 facility that most people at my university are not allowed to enter, where you can do experiments with weaponized bacteria and so on. Many of these centers, by the way, went to fairly minor state universities. Those are the ones at the bottom of the list here, that were struggling for funding and were not too scrupulous about the terms attached to some of this funding. So in closing, the contrast between the fate of Iraqi and American universities over the last decade could not be starker. Occupying different structural relationships to the same war, the one has been starved of resources, many of its buildings destroyed, and its faculty fired, assassinated, forced into exile, while the other has seen an influx of resources for new buildings, new research programs, and new hires. There have been costs to American universities too, but they've been not so much financial as existential, and they're therefore harder to perceive and to quantify. But take the example of public health. The public health community saw an opportunity in the post-9/11 concern with bioterrorism, and they secured a considerable infusion of resources into public health. Yet the result has been a partial militarization of public health that has done nothing to make the American public more healthy. While the US ranks 36th among nations in life expectancy, and has considerable public health problems with diabetes, heart disease, neonatal disease, and foodborne disease, problems that kill large numbers of Americans every year, The preoccupation with bioterrorism, which has killed 5 Americans since 9/11, has skewed resources toward preparedness for attacks with plague, anthrax, tularemia, and smallpox. The US is funding research into and preparedness for the threat that excites Hollywood scriptwriters while ignoring the mundane threats that are killing Americans every day. Universities have become conduits for a funding choice that is killing Americans by default. We can imagine a world where the US government pays the tuition fees of future social workers and lawyers for the poor, as well as CIA agents. But that's not the world that we live in. The government will buy you a degree if you go and agree to work for an intelligence agency, but not if you're going to be a lawyer for the poor. Our world is instead one where the university is being discreetly tilted in favor of the national security state to push students into careers and researchers into projects they would otherwise eschew. So, to close, 2 countries, several universities, 1 war. The costs have been disproportionately borne by Iraqis, whose suffering demands our acknowledgement. But war damages its victors too, in ways that are just harder to see. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Bob, for inviting me here, and it's been great today listening to all the different talks. And I probably am the odd person here, being an English professor, I consider myself in American Studies, but I hope I have something to add to this. One way I just want to say broadly where my talk will be a little bit different is that a lot of us have focused on sort of the cultures of surveillance, the kinds of ways in which academics have silenced themselves, the coercive kind of aspects of post 9/11 culture. And I'm going to focus a little bit more on the consensual aspects of that culture. In other words, to show how power is working productively, because that's how power works in the long term. Not so much by, although the coercion is terribly important, but also by the idea of consent. So I'll basically have 2 parts to my talk. And in the first one, I want to talk about the role of universities in imperialism and carrying out the project of empire, which I don't think is terribly unusual, actually, or unique to the 9/11 moment. And I apologize, I'm also going to do a historical example. And then I want to talk about humanistic education as a technology of imperial governance. And in the second part of my talk, which is a little bit shorter, I'm going to focus on my field, which is American Studies and Empire. And since it's the last talk, I think you'll appreciate, I'm going to start by talking about a couple of cartoons. So if I can, okay, and how do I get it big? F5. What? F5, okay. Okay, so this cartoon is from 1899, and it appeared in Puck. It's a pro-McKinley New York weekly. And that weekly actually used imperial as a term of praise. So this cartoon shows the classroom as colonial space. Uncle Sam attempts to teach the 4 possessions, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Guam, and Cuba, into submission. The writing of the board differentiates between, I don't know how clear it is, so I can read it out, between the British and the US only in part. The board reads, quote, "The consent of the governed is a good thing in theory, but very rare in fact. England has governed her colonies whether they consented or not. By not waiting for their consent, she has greatly advanced the world's civilization. The US must govern its new territories with or without their consent. until they can govern themselves. And this is, of course, referring back to the arguments in the Senate about what the consent of the governed actually means. Uncle Sam is a stern teacher, and the classroom, of course, keeps a racial status quo. With a black person, you see, wiping the windows. The Native American who's reading a book upside down, and the Chinese person who is seeking entry. And of course, there are lots of other things going on in this picture here. Okay, so this is something that also appeared in Pak in 1901. And in this one, I don't know if you can read the bottom. Yeah, you can. We see Uncle Sam enacting McKinley's policy of benevolent assimilation for the Philippines. The Filipinos are offered two choices, the soldier or the teacher, and Uncle Sam has plenty of both. And he knows that both are equally weighted, equally strong instruments of colonial rule. The soldier is ruled by force, the school teacher, and interestingly, they are gendered here, although in fact, most of the teachers who went to the Philippines, the Thomasites, were men. But they gender it, and this is very much the gendering. It's a cultural component that education is part of a female enterprise. So the school teacher is ruled by teaching, basically what Gramsci called hegemony. And as many of the scholars who are working on this material in the Philippines have noted, that this massive project of schooling in the Philippines and the creation of an enlightened citizenry was a matter of governance, of Foucauldian governance. And at the forefront, look at this, there's another one here, which is doing the same thing. But at the forefront of educational policies in the Philippines were very prestigious professors from American universities who participated in and were constantly consulted in the colonial project. Even before the treaty to bring the Philippine Islands under the US sovereignty was ratified by the Senate, McKinley asked Jacob Sherman, professor of English and philosophy, and current president of Cornell University, to head the first Philippine Commission. Sherman, who was honored by the request, wrote a few years later, and I'm quoting him, to aid the government at Washington in shaping that policy and to cooperate with the naval and military authorities at Manila in the effective extension of American sovereignty over the archipelago were the principal functions which the president was to assign the commission. And the commission convinced the insurgents of the humane and beneficent intentions of our government and satisfied them that American sovereignty was really another name for their own liberty. And they they recommended the establishment of public education and the teaching of English. And the teaching of English, to me particularly, is interesting because it was not, it was recommended very strongly and instituted ostensibly as a means of unifying an area which had all these warring tribes and so on. But it was also seen as English was a language through which could breathe the airs of Anglo-Saxon democracy. The language itself was weighted with value. Another member of the commission was Dean C. Worcester, who was a zoology professor at the University of Michigan, and he wrote a section called The Native Peoples of the Philippines. And again, this was a lot of them wrote about all these different tribes in the Philippines to argue against self-government, and wrote, their experiences and travelogues. And he wrote a book called The Philippine Islands and Their People, which became a bestseller, and that was in turn consulted to frame colonial policy. 25 years later, Paul Monroe, a professor of education at Columbia University, headed a survey of the educational system in the Philippine Islands. And he was very thorough and objective in his assessments. How have the schools gone? Let's see how they're doing. And he says, in fact, there have been so many reforms in education in the US. There have been progressive movements and so on. And in fact, some of the textbooks here are very static. You haven't done quite enough. However, in the preface to this long survey that he brings out, he talks about the educational policy in the Philippines and the establishment of massive establishment of a number of schools in the area as an adventure in human enlightenment more bold than taken in any Oriental setting, embodying the ideas of universality, practicality, and democracy. And then he wrote, very impressed, under the very guns of the American troops, schools were established. Wherever the American flag went, a school was found. And so the schools were sort of the embodiment of democracy. We weren't just getting our guns, we were getting schools. So I just wanted to show this as sort of a small sort of sampling of the involvement of universities in the colonial management of the Philippines. In turn, you see that education was seen as an important means of pacification. And this is not, particularly insidious forms of education. This is the use of literature. This is the use of culture as a forms of pacification, of governing through consent. And recognizing the importance of American universities in sort of training a cadre of Filipino elite, President Roosevelt introduced the pensionado system in 1903, through which hundreds of select Filipino students were sent to study at American universities. And the idea was that they would come here to the US, and William Alexander Sutherland, who oversaw this program, said, well, if they're introduced to this American system and they experience the blessings of the American way of living, such as dignity of labor, desire for self-determination, all of which are really good things, they will become ambassadors for America, and they would help then rule the Philippines. Of course, years later, there was a Filipino educator you might or might not have heard of by the name of Renato Constantino, who savagely critiqued these practices as part of the miseducation of the Filipino. So now you fast forward about 100 years where we are post 9/11, and Hugh, you talk so eloquently and so importantly, so I feel like a bit of a charlatan here with all the statistics you gave about the destruction of universities in Iraq, which is part of the American rule by force, and I think the intellectual costs of that you just simply can't ignore. But I want to say it's also important to pay some attention to the more hegemonic aspects of university education, say in Iraq, for instance, and Afghanistan, through the building of new universities, institutional apparatuses by which you can lead by educating desires, sensibilities, and values. And educating the people, has always been part of, I think, American foreign policy. Wherever we've gone in areas of occupation, we are going to educate people, we're going to uplift them. And of course, education and colonialism have a similar rhetoric, to lift from ignorance, right? And George Bush, in his radio address to the nation shortly after the Iraq invasion, he talked about how Iraq schools have really crumbled under Saddam Hussein, just the opposite of what you were saying. And he talked about how the coalition was working to rebuild Iraq schools, and they'll make the Iraqis proud of their heritage, and so on. And the strategies in Iraq, I'm not saying are parallel to what happened 100 years ago, but the idea of the sort of pacification through education, disturbingly, this is something that is echoed by the left and right alike in many instances. So, and I just give you an example of the way people are looking at some of these institutions. So in 2007, there was the opening of the American University of Iraq, which is a privately funded venture by some neocons, Kurds, and ardent supporters of the Iraq war, like Fuad Ajami, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing his name, of Johns Hopkins, and Kanan Maki of Brandeis, who were on the board of directors of this university. Now, Russ Baker and Christina Borgenson, they wrote a stinging critique of the American University of Iraq, and they criticized this American University of Iraq not so much for its goals, which they saw as secular, lofty, liberal, and so on. And I'll read you the mission statement here, which says it is to, quote, promote the development and prosperity of Iraq through the careful study of modern commerce, economics, business, and public administration, and to lead the transformation of Iraq into a free and democratic society through an understanding of the ideals of liberty and democracy. So what you're doing is basically, having in a mission statement how there's this schooling through certain core American values, which will then be used to govern the population. And when you have the critique of this by Baker and Borgenson, what they criticize is sort of the corrupt administrator. Joshua Mitchell, this Georgetown professor of political theory, and he says, well, he's like a classic colonial official. He's of the Christian right and so on. But they don't critique the idea of governing through this idea of education for democracy. And of course, it's not very surprising that somebody like Christopher Hitchens, who of course supported the Iraq War, he writes articles urging us to help build democracy in Iraq. Partly through establishing a library in English for the American University of Iraq. Let's help democratize Iraq by contributing to this library. Let's, replenish their knowledge, that kind of thing. And the more blatant kind of schooling Iraqis in Americanism is, of course, the rewriting of history textbooks, which I think you partly mentioned how in trying to counter Saddam's version of history, as in the Gulf War, the US officials recruited Fuad Hussein, a professor of Middle East Studies who had left Iraq to teach in the Netherlands, and they were told, well, you need to quickly produce these textbooks which have a different kind of view of the Gulf War and the Ba'ath Party and so on, and they didn't know how to do it that fast. So what do? They rewrite the textbooks and they have no reference to the Ba'ath Party at all. So it's like all wiped out, So that's what you have in the textbook. But that's a much more blatant kind of form. I'm actually interested also in the insidious aspects. Afghanistan is another area, of course, that has been the object of colonial uplift. And Hugh, you talked about this, and particularly is this figure of the woman in the burqa who is waiting freedom, right? And so the fantasy of unveiling, which was like over and over, you see the face of the liberated Afghan women. And this is a recycling of a very familiar 19th century colonial narrative of saving these brown women. And this has been harnessed by a lot of NGOs who are running educational programs, which have ties to American universities as well. So you have Paula Nerschel, who has the initiative to educate Afghan women. A little flyer here. And the universities that participate, some of them are Bucknell, Mary Washington, Hollins, and Mount Holyoke College. They participate in that. They provide scholarships to Afghan women to study in the US. They want them to go back. They're required to go back to help with the reconstruction of their countries back at home. And you can sort of think of this in a sense as a privatized version of the pensionado scheme that you had with the Philippines. And the initiative itself, which is described in terms of this benevolence, and I don't know if you can read quite that, but I can read that for you. It sort of echoes, Laura Bush, I don't know if you remember, gave the presidential, the weekly address in place of George Bush, talking about, well, I'm giving this talk on Thanksgiving, to tell people the progress that we have made in Afghanistan, and how because of our troops there, so many women are being saved. So feminism being used as a justification for the war. And so the mission statement here for this initiative is almost the same. It says, not so long ago, all of us were haunted by the images of the women of Afghanistan. Covered head to toe in the burqa, they were denied the right to health care, freedom, and education. Like many, Paula Nerschel was affected by those. Wrap up? Oh my God. Was affected by the images. Okay. Okay. I mentioned this not because there's anything wrong in being haunted by those kinds of images, but it's the use of the images to sort of justify this kind of imperialism. And the goal of the mission is to also help educate the next generation of Afghan women by providing these kind of role models. These people come here, go back. And by the way, Paula Nerschel, I'm trying to wrap up, but it's a great story. She discovered this, and she did this to help Afghan women. There is no acknowledgement at all of indigenous women's rights organizations right there in Afghanistan that have been working for a long time to help these women. There's the white woman pioneer goes there and does all this. So I guess what I'm saying is that there are many ways in which university and academics who might not be associated with the military in any kind of way, under the benign banner of education, participate in this sort of project of imperial governance. I had a second part to my talk, which I guess I can go into, right? You want me to stop?
Reception.
What?
That's for the reception.
That's it. Okay, 2 minutes? Yeah. Okay, I'll just summarize this, and it might not be that interesting, but in a field of American studies, which is basically literature, culture, history, sociology, and so on, interdisciplinary kind of field, it has Cold War origins. So in F.O. Mattison's The American Renaissance, which was like a defining work of the 50s, these people, that's when he talked about major American writers, Whitman, Thoreau, Emerson, Hawthorne, and so on. They were basically different models of the possibilities of democracy. And so the field is sort of a Cold War kind of field. Now the field has really shifted. So what I wanted to talk about was, and it shifted interestingly. One of the key books that came out was in 1993 called The Cultures of United States Imperialism. And it had a bunch of essays, but the introduction to that volume was written by Amy Kaplan, in which she talked about the opening sentence of that was kind of paradigm shifting, I suppose. It was the field of American studies was founded on the banks of the Congo. By which she meant to say is that one of the historians who had been writing about American culture and history for a long time, Perry Miller, said in his preface, I wanted to write about the Puritans because when I was in the oil tankers going to Africa, I had this kind of vision that I wanted to formulate about America. But of course, when he writes about all that, Africa just kind of disappears, and then you have the Puritan origins, and Virginia is just kind of forgotten, and you step on the Plymouth Rock and so on, that kind of history. And so what has happened is that, especially post 9/11, in contrast to what people have been saying, the culture of silence and secrecy, talking about empire and American studies is very much in. You've had conference after conference after conference after conference where hundreds of people will be presenting on this kind of thing. The studies of empire are very much part of this, the whole thing. And so what I wanted to, and I'll just wrap this up in 30 seconds then. So this is very different from what was being talked about earlier when you had something like American culture is going to talk about the values of democracy in this exceptional kind of way. So but I think I am a little bit concerned about how this kind of American studies particularly is projected. In other words, and there's a person, Wendy Brown, who talks about this more eloquently than I can do, but she talks about tolerance as a technology of governmentality. In other words, the idea that you can just have tolerance, and this can have many manifestations. Anti-imperialism is a form of tolerance, right? And this can be itself seen as a mark of American exceptionalism and recruited in the service of empire. And this does not have to be done in coercive ways, like having people like Mark Jacobs of the State Department say, hear writers talk about what it means to be American. But on the other hand, you can have I think what I want to say is that the anti-imperial American studies, the imperialism of anti-imperial studies also needs to be sort of thought about. In other words, you need to decolonize the anti-imperial imaginary as well. Otherwise, you remember that central character in Avatar? What is his name? Jake in Avatar, who is, for all the natives and so on like that. And he is the classic kind of person who you need to think about, i.e. the anti-imperial person who is, classically American, who goes around. And so I think we need to be really careful, even in those kind of moments, how we, think about a field like American studies, which is so anti-imperial. What does it mean that this is at the center, right? And I just want to give one example, and I will stop. This is very much in, but the governance of this body itself, American studies, all the top positions in American studies, whether it's the president and so on, they're all Americans. We pay some sort of obeisance to foreign scholars. We say, of course, we should invite them in, give them some money, but they never have any particular positions of power. And there are certain fields that are still in, there are certain fields that are out. And so I think you're going to give the more hopeful talk. So I will just stop here. But Edward Said talked hopefully, and this is a person who was reviled in the academy, right? And he talked about how, he said, the American university is the one public space available to real alternative intellectual practices. Great of him to say that. So I'd like to think so, but I think it's a space that we really need to think about decolonizing as well. Sorry, I've gone over.
The points been made several times that we make up our opinions and we have a stance for the subject matter on some kind of emotional as well as rational basis. And I have this congenital disease that I can't talk without handing out a photocopy. So that's one of my thank you.
Thank you.
So my name is Paul Joseph. I teach sociology and work in the Peace Studies program at Tufts University. And part of my background is that I've been the director of the Peace and Justice Studies program for many years at Tufts and have served 2 times as president nationally of the Peace Studies Association in the United States. And I did mention a research project that I've been involved with the human terrain teams. And another one, the one before that, is called Are Americans Becoming More Peaceful? Kind of a provocative title. And I was intrigued by the discussion at the end of the previous panel, which was establishing a dialectic between pessimism and optimism. And that book, Are Americans Becoming More Peaceful, is the glass half full, optimistic take on American public opinion with regard to war and peace issues. And I think there too, there's kind of an emotional stance that we have towards the subject matter that we study, as well as an intellectual and a rational stance towards it. And I'm condemned in some way to being at least guardedly optimistic. And I very much appreciate in the discussion we've been having today about the many references to hegemony and Antonio Gramsci. And one of his many sayings that I think is appropriate is that we need to have pessimism of the intellect, but optimism of the will. Pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. And that's certainly a stance that you'll see reproduced in this field of peace studies. So there's not much time, and I want to be brief, and it's the end of a long day, but I'll try to lay out a few themes. Some of these themes will also establish its own dialectic, its own tensions within the field of peace studies as well. So 9/11, 10 years ago, almost to the week. And I remember very clearly a meeting of our first meeting of the year of the local executive board at Tufts University of our Peace Studies program. And the meeting ended about 10 o'clock, and I walked out into the hallway of the campus center, and there were the TV screens showing the attacks on the World Trade Center. And the first building had just started to come down, and like everyone, I was transfixed at those television screens and looking at it and thinking about so many things. One of them was that my brother-in-law worked at the World Trade Center and thankfully made it out of there. And I had just come out of the meeting, and I thought among the many things on the list was, we are screwed, meaning that I could see what the reaction was going to be to the attacks on 9/11 and its implications on the academy. And over the course of this day, many people from many different angles have discussed the constraints that have come onto the university because of the general political, cultural changes that have taken place in the world and the United States, and then also the more specific changes that have taken place in the university structure. Hugh did not have a chance to elaborate all of that, but the end of his very good paper talks about some of the more subtle changes as well as the budget changes that have taken place in universities too. But an irony or a paradox from the standpoint of peace studies is that it has also been a growth for peace studies. A real irony of peace studies, and its position in the university, is that war is good for the expansion of peace studies. And if you look periodically over the changes of when peace studies programs have flourished and when they've ebbed, it's during the Vietnam War and during the Cold War and over the last decade, especially the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, that the number of programs, the number of students taking the majors in various universities as connections with global programs have actually expanded significantly rather than contracted. So there's this paradox about peace studies expanding in time of war. And yet, its foundational concept, if you had to take the 25-word sentences for defining the field, is that peace means something more than the mere absence of war. That's the so-called negative definition of peace. And I apologize for those of you who are somewhat familiar with these discussions, but I'm going to assume that you're not, that peace is something more than the state of non-war, the negative definition of war, because you can still have armaments, you can still have a threat system, you can still have economic costs of war, you can still have cultural preparations for war, many, many different costs of war that accumulate from a war system, even though the war itself is not hot. And the field substitutes for the negative definition of peace a positive peace, or a peace without structural violence. The tension here is between the fact that negative peace is almost always a good thing. It's very hard to find instances where war brings a positive, but if that's not a sufficient condition of peace, what's to replace it? So peace studies also has a very strong utopian component of peace, not just the absence of war, in which we want to consider peace with justice, we want to consider peace in connection with gender equity, with environmental sustainability, with a whole bunch of good things. which is opening up the door to a broader, more expansive sense of peace. If you take a look briefly at that little handout that that Bob distributed just a moment ago, you can get some sense of the field by looking down the vertical column of the first table, showing that peace is not just focusing on nation-state international conflict, but also group conflict and individual conflict and violence. Different people in the field will work at different kinds of levels. It's an interdisciplinary field where psychologists are operating, sociologists are operating, and students of international relations are operating as well. It has many different sides and many different faces. The discussion group for the Peace and Justice Studies National Association is humming this week as the consequence of the execution in Georgia a couple of days ago. And that's considered the reaction to it, and the challenge to capital punishment is one of the subfields of peace studies. And then if you move across the horizontal columns, examining causes and consequences of violent conflict, which brings it towards conventional examinations of the sources of violence, but also the mechanics of managing and reducing and resolving violent conflict, which is really a focus in one way or another, on conflict resolution, or a term that's often used in the field, conflict transformation. And if I put my pet peeve into the curriculum committee of my university and a list of all the distribution requirements, what we would like to see students take, in addition to a math requirement and a language requirement and some writing ability, I would say that some exposure to conflict resolution is an important part of the toolkit, the cultural toolkit, part of the technique of going through life, because in our personal lives, in our work lives, in our social lives, we will not live without conflict. We can hopefully live without violence, but social conflict and difference and the collision between them is, I think, an inevitable part of our existence as human beings, but that can be grappled with in more rational, productive ways or in less productive ways. And we need to be better informed about that and to be more practiced with it. And then over on the right, the development of the values, norms, and institutions for building peace, which is more towards the positive end of the spectrum, where we want to see about what is crucial for this utopian dimension, for this more positive sense of peace as well. Peace studies programs come in different flavors and different names. And if you went through the list of programs in the United States and the world, you'd see some that were called peace and security, which is more focused on what the overlap is, what the conversation is between peace studies and international relations about war. And then you see some like my own, which is peace and justice studies, which is oriented towards the more expansive end and looking at positive peace. The field also has an ongoing, sustained root in ethical practices and religion. So when I mention peace and justice studies programs, most of those have occurred or developed in faith-based institutions. Tufts University is one of the few examples of a peace and justice studies major in a secular institution. The others are largely in Catholic institutions or Mennonite institutions or where there are Quaker institutions where there is some injunction to pursue peace. Not so much in secular ones, which tend to be more something called peace and security rather than peace and justice. And there are very important gender consequences for this as well, because those that are peace and security studies tend to have more males. Those that are peace and justice studies tend to have more women. Our own program in Tufts is probably 75 or 80% female. The IR program at Tufts is probably 60 or 65% male. So we want to be aware or cognizant of that as well. National security, the title of this program, of this day, and something that is a concept near and dear to the heart of the field. of international relations. Now that's something, a concept that is systematically interrogated by the field of peace studies and offers as a substitute the idea of human security rather than national security. So a couple of quick comparisons. This may be familiar with you. National security focused primarily on the state. Human security focused on the quality of life of people. National security focused oftentimes being militarized or focused on the protection of political institutions. Human security having multiple dimensions in which education, health, literacy, all forms of gender and ethnic equity are raised as well. National security focused on a way of governance in which I would say, following the realist principle, governance where the enemy of my enemy is my friend, which often gets us into a lot of trouble. Whereas we can see in Iraq and Afghanistan, I think, renewed recognition of the importance of governance. But governance, I think, requires a lot of patience and a lot of time. And if one thing we've learned is the building of a civil society is a long-term project. It needs a lot of tender, loving care, and it cannot be imposed and it cannot be created quickly. And even though there are parts of civil society that may look very differently from our own, and if we rely on more traditional local institutions, we hope that they change, but they need to be changed primarily on the basis of the dynamics of the population in those places, not something that's brought by the United States or by another European country to the table. And then finally, national security is, generally speaking, unilateral, something that a powerful country or the United States wants to bring and protect for itself. And one of the things about human security is the recognition of the need of a global effort to do that. So the field is very interesting. It has its own, as well as these sort of normative questions and issues that I've very briefly tried to lay out. It has very interesting set of research agendas. Some of them overlap with the topics that we've discussed earlier today. One of the most interesting to me is, what is reconciliation? What is the recovery from violence? How much did the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa achieve, and how much was pushed under the table? If we look at Uganda and its fragile efforts to return towards normalcy and maybe incomplete, to what level do we use a retributive model of justice for Joseph Kony and the Lord's Resistance Army and all the abuses that were inflicted on children and other civilians as part of that struggle? And to what degree is there a role for traditional practices and traditional healing in that country as well? Can we celebrate the progress that's been made, even though it's something that always needs to be revisited in places like Ireland, where to seemingly intractable conflict, considerable progress has been made? How was that made? How were not only violence between Catholics and Protestants worked upon, but also between extremists and moderates among the Catholic community and within the Protestant community worked upon as well? Not only a dialectic between those two, but within as well. Very interesting research being conducted in that area as well. Is there a culturally specific component for conflict resolution and conflict transformation? I mean, there's some techniques that have been suggested, but how would those be modified in different times and in different places, even if we want to think that the field should encourage an exploration of alternatives to violence as well? So there are many more things that I could list. I just list this as an optimistic kind of project that is taking place in universities. It's not completely blue sky. It's blue sky with maybe some clouds scudding over. And one of the things I really try to emphasize with my students is that peace is not easy. Peace is hard. Peace is a challenge. Peace is frustration. Peace is often a sense of time being lost. But people are still, fortunately, driven to it. They have to do it. And I like to think that part of our human nature, part of our biological destiny is to strive for cooperation and peace even more strongly than it is to strive and be competitive and to express our relationship in war. Thank you.
We do have a little time for questions if people have the patience and desire for questions.
People don't want to leave probably at this point.
I have a question for you. It was a very moving presentation of the horrors that were wrought in and on Iraq by the U.S. beginning well before Bush II. And living in Miami, I'm very aware, for example, of the long-term effort to strangle Cuba and in some of the same ways, the most basic of material resources. But I missed in the talk a little of the causation. The universities tell us what about the Saddam Hussein government that we should revisit our assessment of it, and that it was a kind of authoritarian developmentalist regime whose demise we ought sorely to regret, or that there is no connection between having a substantial higher education apparatus and the political or moral virtue of the society that has it. I mean, I'm not endorsing any one of those positions, but I kind of missed in your presentation what the existence of that system. I understood better what our neglect of it after we took the place over. What that says, I understand much more clearly. But are you entirely agnostic on the Anshan regime of Iraq? Maybe you could fill us in a little bit.
Well, I was deliberately staying away from those questions. Thank you for bringing them up. I tried to signal with a brief aside that I was neither trying to valorize nor condemn Saddam Hussein's regime. I was more interested in the damage that we did to the university infrastructure. I mean, if you press me, I would say, like most regimes, it's complicated. There are some things that regime did in terms of bringing material benefits to the people that made it the envy of many third world developing countries. Now, there was a terrible price for that in terms of political prisoners, arbitrary executions, the Iran-Iraq war, and all the rest of it. So on one side of the ledger, it was a terrible regime. On the other side, it was a terrible regime that brought education to large numbers of its people, brought public health initiatives, brought material prosperity to people, and the social structure in terms of inequality was relatively flat in some ways. I mean, there were widespread benefits for people at the bottom of the society. Would I advocate that Iraq should have stayed in that state forever? No. I mean, one would hope that there might have been a more peaceful evolution of that society into one that would maintain the benefits of the material benefits of the regime without the political repression. So my main point, I guess, is that the neoconservatives were like a bull in a china shop. They sort of blundered into Iraq, partly for their own realpolitik reasons, about reconfiguring the Middle East, laying claim to oil and so on. But they put a narrative frame around Iraq that was simplistic and mistaken in some cases, about this being a backward, benighted country that needed our modernizing touch, as Malini was pointing out. And in many ways, that frame was mistaken. And furthermore, as Tom Friedman likes to say, you break it, you own it. We took a university system that didn't have a lot of freedom of speech, but it did well at cranking out engineers and doctors and so on, and we broke it. And we've decided that we don't have a responsibility to rebuild it. It's like going into an antique shop, breaking a beautiful piece of antique china and shrugging your shoulders and say, oh, sorry, not my problem. We broke it, we should be paid to rebuild it.
And the second half of that is, I think, beyond dispute. I mean, my memory is fading a little bit as well, but I don't think that the portrait of Iraq as a backward, as Afghanistan, or what Afghanistan subsequently became, was the portrait of Iraq at in September of 2001. I recall Saddam being portrayed much more as the developmental dictator, the vain, glorious, but somewhere between Mussolini and Frederick I or something. You know, I don't. So it makes me think that there's some other, something else that we held against him that isn't.
And what is that something else?
I have a much cruder understanding of what we were up to. You know,
Which is what?
I think what you say validates the regime, and that we should put back on the table the authenticity of indigenously developed, semi-dictatorial regimes that have ugly sides. I mean, there are more people per capita in American prisons than anywhere else. We just don't talk about it. So, you know, I think taking your presentation seriously, I find it a salutary vindication of Saddam.
Well, it was certainly not intended to be read that way. And I think that the Middle East and the Third World offer other opportunities. I mean, somewhere like Bhutan, where they have a gross national happiness product that they measure instead of wealth, and they have a very flat socioeconomic structure. We could talk about that as a model. They don't have lots of people in jail. They also don't have people dying on the street for lack of health care and so on. Even within the Middle East, there were, Lebanon before its troubles was a democratic regime that had a vibrant intellectual life. It was good at producing wealth, and it didn't fill up its prisons with people. So, before valorizing Saddam Hussein, I would want to look at some other models.
We'll make this the last question on that.
Okay. This is for Mr. Joseph. You said at the very end of your presentation that peace is hard, but isn't this assessment only based upon all the paradigms and values that are held most dear to this global system? For instance, the idea that cutthroat competition and beating your brother or sister harder than they beat you in the economic arena is the be all and end all of human existence. Wouldn't in fact peace be easy if people would only dare to consider the advantage of the other to their brothers and sisters, and not only the advantage of their own limited self.
Mm-hmm. So thank you for the opportunity to clarify what I meant there. I agree with you if you think that you can make peace on the basis of a narrow definition of national security, and that if you want peace, you prepare for war, and you occasionally exercise that. People think that human beings are competitive, and if you beat your brother harder than he beats you, you'll have a good family. People think that they're being realistic when they're that, and I think they're being idealistic if they think that that's the basis for forming a good society. No, I meant, so there we agree. But if we just take an optimistic scenario that the world unifies around the idea of adapting to climate change and wants to pursue some way of reducing global warming gases in a way that's equitable across the world, and they want to pursue climate justice. I don't think that even given that goodwill, which we don't have, but even if we had it, I don't think that would be an easy question about how to determine what climate justice would be. How would CO2 emissions be shared? Would there be a market for that? How would we have an ethical evaluation of nature? Would we have a right to occasionally pollute? Would we consign some people to lower levels of development than others? What if some country really wanted more consumer goods? Should we reduce our standard of living, try to substitute a gross index of happiness rather than a GNP measure of our living? Who is going to regulate this on a global basis? What's our research funding for long-term substitute technologies? Those are not easy questions, and I can see people of goodwill, countries and groups of goodwill, having significant disagreements over that question. That's a peaceful path, but not an easy path. I think it's a better path than allowing the oil economy to dictate our choices, which is happening right now. I can't see peace in that in a lot of different angles. But I don't think we can just take a few terms. It's going to be more equitable, it's going to be sustainable, alternative energy, and think that's going to solve the problems.
In the spirit of contributing to gross domestic happiness, but with food that is much better than Bhutanese food, and I know this because my son came back from Bhutan about 6 months ago. We have a reception in the lower rotunda around the corner. I have enjoyed today thoroughly, and I thank each and every one of you for your participation. I thank the speakers who have had to leave for the airport and those who are still here. Thank you very much. This has been extraordinarily interesting, and please join me in thanking this last panel and in all the panelists.
And I think I speak for everyone, too, in thanking Case Western University, the law school, for putting this on, and for Bob for organizing, and the other staff. I don't see Nancy. Is she here?
Alice.
Nancy and Alice are probably outside because they are always making sure.
So we can thank them personally,
right.
but things were very well organized. It was a pleasure to be here, and thank you to Case Western.